Are you younger than 29 years old, living in the United States or Canada, and having attended public education for some or most of your career as a student? Do you have trouble socializing with others? Are you adverse to social conflict or prone to feelings of mistrust and betrayal around others? How long has it been since you last organically began a friendship with a stranger you met in real life? Have you ever been accused of being childish, strange, or otherwise very unpleasant to interact with? It turns out you're not alone, which you might have noticed by just looking around. But why? Why are so many otherwise normal young people so socially stunted in so many strange ways? What universal factor is responsible for this? As is starting to become a pattern, this particular social dysfunction began in the year 1990, at the rough cultural apogee of the Reagan-Bush dynasty, and the end of the 12-year imperium of neoconservative politics. The year 1990 marked a turning point in American history, the rough moment in time where the post-war Pax Americana period started choking on its food in the restaurant, but still a little more than a decade before it was loaded into the ambulance, and a few decades before the point we're at now, sitting in the lobby at the hospital waiting for the bad news. The turn of the decade from the 80s to the 90s was still an optimistic time for America. Some of the greatest cultural and technological achievements of the century had yet to occur, and the demons born from the Reaganite era were still cute and small in their cradles. One problem that people did have going into the 90s was crime. The Reaganite war on drugs had created a culture of street gangs across America's major cities, and other simultaneous phenomena like the wave of government workers going postal left the average person seriously worried about violence. One arena of violence that was of particular and growing concern was the school. While the tragedy that defined this trend was still a decade away, the presence of weapons in schools, especially those in struggling urban school districts, was a serious and growing problem. The call for legislation came, and in 1990, the federal response came in the form of the Gun-Free School Zone Act, proposed by Democrat Congressman Herb Kohl, and enacted into law as part of the wider 1990 Crime Control Act. The law was deemed unconstitutional once, and challenged for repeal many times, unsuccessfully by congressional contrarians Ron Paul and Thomas Massie. The Gun-Free School Zone Act is still law today, altered only to add a loophole to get around the original constitutional challenge. The law made it illegal to possess or discharge a firearm within school grounds, or within 1,000 feet of them, accepting only private residences from this rule. While this was a major legislative step, it was not enough to change the growing trend. The 1990s were a uniquely violent period in American history, spiking during the presidential reign of George H.W. Bush and being a major factor in his re-election defeat against Democrat challenger Bill Clinton, which marked the end of 12 years of uninterrupted Republican rule. The next attempt at solving the school gun crime epidemic came in 1994, with the redundantly named Gun-Free Schools Act. This bill was more proactive than the first. Rather than simply criminalizing the presence of guns at schools, it included something called the Zero Tolerance Policy. This mandated that schools were required to enforce a minimum punishment of a 1-year expulsion on any student caught bringing a gun to school, and if they failed to do so, their federal funding would be cut. Not only did this force action out of schools that had been turning a blind eye to the problem, it also gave administrators a powerful tool for cleaning up their classrooms and hallways. In any social environment, there is a tendency for the majority of the violation of rules and norms to be carried out by a small population of repeat offenders. Using the zero tolerance policy, schools had the ability to remove the worst offenders from their classrooms for a year at a time and claim that the federal government had their hands tied if there was any pushback. The structure of American education is scaffolded, meaning that the curriculum is designed to build on itself from kindergarten to 12th grade graduation, and missing any step along the way will make it difficult to progress further. Being absent from school for any period longer than a week can become a serious obstacle to effective learning, since the content in the classroom will be reliant on information you missed while you were gone. In most cases, a 1-year suspension is an educational death sentence, and at that point there's very little reason to even bother going back. Now perhaps that's a sensible punishment for a hoodlum who's walking around school strapped, but the biggest criticisms of this law come from its fringe applications, like the grade schooler who was cited for an L-shaped piece of paper he had made for a game of cops and robbers. What makes this act most effective is what makes it most dangerous. The enforcement is ensured through the threat of defunding to the schools, who pass that threat along to the teachers, who can be punished or even fired if they're the ones turning a blind eye to the presence of guns in their classroom. With that threat looming over their heads, a teacher would rather punish the kid with the piece of paper than risk being the one punished for missing a potential violation. Despite criticisms, the zero-tolerance policy was effective at eliminating a number of classroom disruptions in the schools that were most affected. The zero-tolerance framework was so effective that school districts began formulating further zero-tolerance policies for other disruptive and criminal behaviors, like drug possession and fighting. Whether it was ethical or not to weaponize expulsion as the primary tool for discipline, schools struggling with behavioral problems had found a golden ticket to simply erase the source of the problems they dealt with day in and day out. Of course, this doesn't actually do anything to solve gun violence. It just takes the streets out of the classroom. It doesn't make the streets any safer. Take, for example, a student who brought a gun to school because he got roped into a gang as a dumb, impressionable teenager. He almost certainly lost any path he had out of gang life when he was expelled from school for a year, taking any opportunity for getting a degree, or even a GED, and finding a safer, more productive role in society. Now back to the question I posed at the beginning. What exactly does this legislation have to do with everyone being weird and antisocial nowadays? Contrary to how we're sometimes portrayed, Americans don't actually require the constant presence of firearms for their social development. Besides the ethical concerns around punitive expulsion, the real social harm caused by the zero-tolerance policy came as the framework filtered down into the approach that schools around the country use for general discipline. Keep in mind, the Gun-Free School Act strictly tied funding penalties to gun infractions only, but the penalty structure was emulated at a smaller scale for the derivative zero-tolerance policies. Typically, disgruntled school teachers don't need an excuse to harass and torment the children who get on their nerves, but zero-tolerance policies give them a framework of fear and externalized blame to expedite and increase the process. The mandatory minimum sentence structure of the zero-tolerance framework presented itself as a weapon to use against those students who were a consistent problem. And maybe not a problem to their classmates, but a problem to you, the disgruntled teacher specifically. The problem here is that the zero-tolerance framework recontextualizes discipline and classroom management around a criminal justice framework, and not a George Soros-funded DA criminal justice framework either. We're talking about Judge Dredd RoboCop type justice here. If Miss Spindle-Lynn, overweight, 47, single, says that you are guilty, and maximum punishment is the only recourse. While suspensions can be very harmful to the student being punished, the threat of suspension is just as harmful to social behaviors generally, especially during the crucial developmental phase children go through in elementary school. To put it into perspective, let me first make a few factual observations about children and their social development. First, extended periods of quietly sitting and listening is difficult for young children to do, and for extended periods of time can be counterproductive and detrimental. Second, elementary-aged boys are much more likely to engage in roughhousing, physical play, and physical confrontation than their female peers. This is a naturally dimorphic behavior independent of socialization or other factors. Third, young boys are about twice as likely as their female peers to fall afoul of disciplinary policies across the board. The model of elementary education used in this country's public schools is for the most part accommodating of these realities. A lot of pedagogy for teaching young children is centered around active, engaged tasks, call and response, and plenty of play, but one area where schools consistently fall short is in discipline. As I mentioned before, young boys are about twice as likely as young girls to be cited for disciplinary infractions, and tend to have a harder time behaving within the expectations of the modern classroom, often leading to punishment and frustration from their teachers. While many observations are quick to blame this problem on malice or incompetence, in reality, the largest factor aggravating this negative status quo is simple logistics. In a word, modern classrooms are crowded. Classrooms with 25 or more students to each teacher have become the norm, not as some cost-cutting measure, but simply due to a lack of manpower. The teaching profession has a lengthy licensing process, a poor work-life balance, a less than positive social reputation, and while teachers often overstate their level of poverty, most teachers are pretty firmly in the lower middle class by real income, despite most of them having college debt to get there. This means there's been a pretty consistent shortfall of teachers to students for decades now, a trend that is only getting worse as a larger and larger share of seats in classrooms are taken up by the ESL children of foreign nationals, who the teachers cannot even directly communicate with, let alone effectively teach. To put it simply, the average student in America is suffering from a deficit of individuated attention. If you teach at a middle or high school with a 7-period structure where you have a 45-minute window to teach a classroom of 30 students, even if you devoted every last second of time to individual attention for students, they'd get 90 seconds each. This becomes an even greater problem when you have to account for classroom disruptions. If a young boy comes back from recess with too much energy, every second of attention spent reining him in is paid for out of the meager time available to the other students. This frustration is what drives much of the hostility teachers tend to show towards troublemaking students, and a big reason that zero-tolerance policy is an attractive tool for them. If you have a student who consistently disrupts and impedes your class, and you simply don't have the time to help him and do the basic functions of your job at the same time, why wouldn't you use the "remove this child from my classroom" button, especially if you can claim you're only fairly enforcing a zero-tolerance policy? This is especially a problem with zero-tolerance bullying policies. Full disclaimer, bullying is bad. Severe bullying can ruin and even take lives, and teachers do have a duty to stop it when they find it happening in their classrooms. Failing to do so is tantamount to child abuse, and someone who willfully ignores bullying between the children they are responsible for has no place around children at all. That being said, zero-tolerance bullying policies have been around for decades. I could cite some stats, like the skyrocketing rates of youth depression and anxiety, but in this case, I think an anecdotal appeal is more effective. Please, in the audience, raise your hand if you attended a public school between 1994 and today. Now please, keep your hand raised if during your public school career you witnessed, participated in, or suffered from bullying. Excusing the blind and deaf in our midst who are not aware that this video is currently playing in the same room they're in, I think it's safe to say that bullying has not been eliminated from public classrooms. Where having a gun in your possession is a simple binary matter, you either have the gun on your person or you don't, bullying is a more abstract and complex pattern of behavior. Bullying is defined by two qualities. First, that it is a repeated behavior, and second, that an uneven power dynamic is at play. While bullying can be difficult to spot, it can be equally difficult to separate real bullying from false positives, especially with young boys. On top of being more physical and occasionally violent in nature, intramural socialization also tends to be hierarchical in nature. Boys have a habit of defining themselves according to the things they're best at, like the fastest runner, the best at soccer, etc. And a lot of their early interactions as they come into social awareness of one another are centered around competition in order to establish a ranking of their various skills. They build relationships according to this competition, and those who have trouble competing, be it due to a lack of ability in whatever arena is being tested, or just poor sportsmanship, struggle to fit in. If a student consistently fails to compete competently, fairly, or without insults and undue bragging, their position in the intramural hierarchy declines, since their peers are less willing to play with somebody who ruins the fun. This dysfunction can devolve into hurt feelings, injured pride, and eventually physical confrontation, which are all crucial elements of social development, if carefully overseen and stopped from escalating too far by an adult. In a sense, these social dynamics are like bonsai trees. They have to be carefully overseen and nurtured, or they'll grow into an aberrant shape or wither away when left to their own devices. Approaching this social dynamic with the zero-tolerance policy is like watering your bonsai tree with a fire hose and trimming it with a chainsaw. With a criminal justice approach to discipline, there has to be a perpetrator and a victim. Once the teacher has decided a relationship constitutes bullying, one student is the bully and the other is the oppressed, regardless of context. One student is coddled and the other is punished with a harmful suspension. Whatever conflict the teacher broke up is still unresolved, and the disparity in treatment is now a sore wound between these two parties. The zero-tolerance policy solves the teacher's problem, the disruption to her classroom, but it does absolutely nothing for the two students affected by it. A major reason zero tolerance has failed to eliminate school bullying is because it only works within the domain that is visible to the teacher. Where it does manage to catch bullying, it simply chases that bullying out of the teacher's line of sight, allowing it to fester in corners and online chats where the teacher can't see it. At the same time, this does very real damage to the social interactions of the young boys caught up in it. It's important for young boys to get into fights when they're small and can't do too much damage to each other. The capacity for violence is a reality of being an adult man, and an expectation they are now automatically enrolled in the moment they turn 18. Learning when it is and isn't acceptable to throw a punch, and developing a proper appreciation of how it feels to both win and lose a fight are crucial social skills that, if neglected, can create a person who instigates needless verbal aggression and suffers from violent ideation as they get older. The time to learn that is when your bones and muscles haven't fully developed, and you're more likely to bruise your ego than break a bone in a scuffle. Of course, teachers have a responsibility to break up fights, but when fighting is judiciously stamped out and punished the moment it crops up, the lessons are never learned, and these crucial learning experiences never happen. I think this phenomenon is best exemplified whenever there's a season of rowdy protest in the country, and you get countless videos of the most soft, gracile people needlessly instigating and coming face to face with physical violence for the first time in their mid-20s. Getting into and losing your first fight at 25, especially against a guy with flashbangs, body armor, and pepper spray, can easily be an ego-killing experience that turns you into a meek zombie who stumbles blindly through the rest of your life in a daze. For young boys less adept at violence, the protectionism of the zero-tolerance policy prevents them from ever developing a strong identity or the ability to act on their own without a strong authority like a teacher or parent to endorse and protect their actions. The label of victim becomes a safe haven for them, and they grow into adulthood crippled by social structures that ensure fairness and redress grievances, leaving them with the resentful attitude of a bullied child as they deal with real life's inequities and cruel unfairness, absent a caring teacher to make things right for them. The inverse is true for the kids marked perpetrator by this policy too. There are a lot of reasons a young kid can be uniquely prone to starting fights, but in most cases that's a negative behavior that needs to be soothed, so that whatever energy animates that tendency can be directed into something more productive, and they can grow into a person capable of cooperating with others. If instead of being treated as a behavioral problem that needs amendment, it becomes a crime with a zero-exception sentence, that attitude is allowed to fester, while repeat suspensions harm the student's educational progress and put them in a position where they are more likely to get into a delinquent and even criminal pattern as they pass into adolescence, with that violent bee still tucked in their bonnet. From federal legislation to school discipline hack, the zero-tolerance policy doesn't solve problems, it simply shuffles them away somewhere else. For a lot of Zero Tolerance's repeat offenders, the suspension used as punishment is nothing more than a vacation from school where they get to sit at home and play Xbox instead of listening to a lecture. Not only does it permanently lock ne'er-do-wells out of the chance to amend their ways and participate in society properly, it inhibits the social development of young boys and leaves them with deficient skills to deal with the difficulties of adult life or even properly form lasting friendships. While I was researching and preparing for this video, an interesting online trend emerged. This image, accompanied by the perception that a large percentage of right-wing politics are influenced by unresolved resentment with grade school teachers. As a pejorative observation, it's pretty funny, but what was interesting was the wave of testimonials that followed. Apparently, a lot of people, independent of politics, suffered a soul-crushing interaction with school discipline that left them with lasting effects. I mentioned the zero-tolerance policy being enforced in absurd ways earlier on in the video, but one of its stranger and more insidious outgrowths is the pathologization and punishment of children's art. I think this one is partially because education is a fallback degree that a lot of college students switch to in their sophomore year after they failed in degrees like nursing and psychology due to too much day drinking and partying in their first semesters. There's a nationwide phenomenon of teachers interpreting the drawings of third-grade boys as indications of early psychopathy or a psychotic violent ideation. The proactivity of the zero-tolerance policy often bleeds into an attitude of Minority Report-esque pre-crime, with teachers actively hunting down the school shooters of tomorrow in their classrooms of sweet, innocent children who are just drawing benign scenes of violence because they're boys and it's cool. If you're a shy, creative type as a kid, probably the most damaging thing that can happen to you is being called into a Karen tribunal in front of your parents, where you having fun with a pencil and some paper has become evidence of you being a threat to society. So severe you need to be singled out, and maybe even medicated for how bad of a person you are at age 9. Other testimonials recount harassment for being too hyper and active, or in even more absurd cases, being chided by teachers for academic overachievement. While there's a certain degree of reality to this trend, it's super anecdotal and not something I can verify independent instances of or provide data to support, but since it was a trend, I thought it'd be good to add it to this video since it seems relevant. Gun violence, bullying, general educational outcomes. All of these things have gotten worse in schools since the introduction of the zero-tolerance policy, and if the state of young people is anything to go by, it might have actually invented a problem worse than the one it tried to solve. There's not really a prescription from me here. If you realize that you're closing on or past 25 and you haven't been punched in the face yet, there's this cool little remedial therapy for that called jujitsu. Just make sure the gym you choose isn't full of psychos who want to give you head trauma to relieve their marital stress. If for some reason you're a person with kids who watches my videos, make sure they spend plenty of time around boys their age outside of school. A lot of the worst social deficits that can happen are things boys will figure out on their own naturally, if they're given a chance to do so. If you had a crazy idea like trying to get rid of the zero-tolerance policy, good luck. While zero-tolerance policies have a negative reputation in academia due to their notable disparate racial impact, they're just too useful for teachers on the ground for that opposition to break through the iron grip of the education policy triad, but that's another topic for another day. Take this all with a grain of salt, of course. There's no long-term studies on the impact of zero-tolerance policies, because educational research is a laughably soft science for how important it is. But I don't think I can confidently say that a system of expulsion is too much worse than the regime of corporal punishment that existed before it, and zero-tolerance is just another tentacle in the Lovecraftian quagmire that is public education. If you were just letting out a sigh of disbelief at the foolishness of the Americans from somewhere else in the developed world, I'm unhappy to report that, like all terrible ideas, this one went international. Canada, for example, had a Safe Schools Act of its own in 2000, with zero-tolerance policies baked in. Zero-tolerance exists as one problem among many, and just one problematic institution among many. But the overly utilitarian approach to school discipline that is so common in this country has widespread impacts that are hard to fully appreciate, let alone quantify. Thank you for watching, and if you have a school discipline horror story from your own childhood, please share it in the comments.